Welcome to the online class of Professor S.K. Paul, HOD, University Department of English, BRA, Bihar University, Muzaffarpur. Dear students of PG Semester 3, CC 13, Unit 1, welcome to my class and good afternoon. Today I am going to deliver my lecture on magical realism. Magical realism was used in Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children. So in that course, I have referred to this term magical realism. But today, I would discuss it in detail. Magical realism is a Magical realism is one of the most unique forms of narrative fiction. It also happens to be one of the easiest genres to fall in love with, weaving elements of magic and fantasy into a realm that's very much rooted in what we know to be real allows the reader to dabble in make-believe. The stories feel relatable while disrupting the notion of objective reasoning and perception, which can be really free. Simply put, magical realism is the perfect genre for anyone with a big imagination and an appreciation for stories and characters they can really connect with and learn from. So, whether you have been devouring magical realism books for as long as you could read, or you are curious to dabble in this hybrid of gritty reality and the divine, you will enjoy our picks for the best magical realism books. Magical realism is a style of fiction and literary genre that paints a realistic view of the modern world while also adding magical elements. Magical realism, perhaps the most common term, often refers to literature in particular with magical or supernatural phenomena presented in an otherwise real world or mundane setting, commonly found in novels and dramatic performances. Despite including certain magic elements, it is generally considered to be a different genre from fantasy because magical realism uses a substantial amount of realistic detail and employs magical elements to make a point about reality, while fantasy stories are often separated from reality. Magical realism is often seen as an amalgamation of real and magical elements that produces a more inclusive writing for than either literary realism or fantasy. The term magic realism is broadly descriptive rather than critically rigorous, and Matthew Streicher in 1999 defines it as what happens when a highly detailed, realistic setting is invaded by something too strange to believe. The term and its wide definition can often become confused as many writers are categorized as magical realists. Irene Gunther, 1995, tackles the German roots of the term and how art is related to literature. Meanwhile, magical realism is often associated with Latin American literature, including founders of the genre, particularly authors Maria Luisa Bombal and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Isabel Allende, George Louis Borges, Juan Rulfo, Miguel Angel Austrias, Elena Caro, Miria Robles, Romulo Coligos, and Arturo Alcer Pietri. In English literature, its chief exponents include Salman Rushdie, Alice Hoffman, Nick Jokin, and Nicola Barker. In Bengali literature, prominent writers of magic realism include Navarun Bhattacharya uh, and uh, and uh, and to some extent Shambaresh Bosu, Shardendu Mukhopadhyay, and Shardendu Banerjee Bandyopadhyay, and moreover Sunil Gangopadhyay, the recipient of the Sahitya Academy Award. So, so uh, in Japanese literature, one of the most important authors of this genre is Haruki Murakami. In Polish literature, magic realism is represented by Olga Tokarczuk, and Nobel Prize laureate in literature. The term first appeared as the German magician Realismus, magical realism. In 1925, German art critic Franz Roh used magician realismus to refer to a painterly style known as a new slash kit, a new objectivity, an alternative to Expressionism that was championed by German museum director Gustav Hartlaub. Roh identified magic realism's accurate detail, smooth photographic and realism's by realism's accurate detail, smooth photographic clarity, and portrayal of the magical nature of the rational world. It reflected the uncanniness of people and our modern technological environment. The first novels categorized as magical realism were the ones of Maria Luisa Bumble. However, at the time, a distinction was yet to be made between the genre and surrealism. Rowe believed that magic realism was yet to be made between the genre and surrealism. Rowe believed that magic realism was related to but distinct from surrealism due to magic realism's focus on material object and the actual existence of things in the world as opposed to surrealism's more abstract, psychological, and subconscious reality. German magic realist paintings influenced the Italian writer Massimo Bottempelli, who has been called the first to apply magic realism in writing, aiming to capture the fantastic, mysterious nature of reality. In 1926, he founded the Magic Realist magazine 900 Novecento, and his writings influenced Belgian magic realist writers Johann Disney and Hubert Lampo. Rowe's magic realism also influenced writers in Hispanic America, where it was translated in 1927 as Realismo Magico. Venezuelan writer Arturo Usler and Pietri, who had known Bontempelli, wrote influential magic realist short stories in the 1930s and 40s that focused on the mystery and reality of how we live. Louis Riel, Louis Lille attests that Petrie seemed to have been the first to adopt the term realismo magico in Hispanic America in 1948. There is evidence that Mexican writer Elena Caro used the same term to describe the words of E.T.A. Hoffman, but dismissed her own work as a part of the genre. French Russian Cuban writer Alezo Carpentier, who rejected Rowe's magic realism as tiresome pretension, developed his related concept to real marvelous realism in 1949. Maggie Ann Bowers, writers that writers that marvelous realist literature and art expresses the seemingly opposed perspectives of a pragmatic, practical, and tangible approach to reality and an acceptance of magic and superstition within an environment of differing cultures. Magic realism was later used to describe the uncanny realism by such American painters as Ivan Albright, Peter Boom, and Paul Cadmus, Gray Foy, George Tucker, and Viennese-born Henry Conner, among other artists during the 1940s and 1950s. However, in contrast with its use in literature, magic realist art does not often include overtly fantastic or magical content, but rather it looks at the mundane through a hyper realistic and often mysterious lens. The term magical realism, as opposed to magic realism, first emerged in the 1955 essay Magical Realism in Spanish American Fiction by critic Angel Flores, in reference to writing that combines aspects of magic realism and marvelous realism, while Flores named George Louis Borges as the first magical realist. He failed to acknowledge either Carpentier or Petrie for bringing Rowe's magic realism to Latin America. Borges is often seen as a predecessor of magical realists, with only Flores considering him a true magical realist. After a Flores essay, there was a resurgence of interest in marvelous realism, which after the Cuban Revolution of 1959 led to the term magical realism being applied to a new type of literature known for matter-of-fact portrayal of magical events. What are the characteristics of magic realism? The extent to which the characteristics below apply to a given magic realist next varies. Every text is different and employs a smattering of the qualities listed here. However, they accurately portray what one might expect from a magic realist text. Fantastical elements. Magical realism portrays fantastical events in an otherwise realistic tone. It brings fables, folktales, and myths into contemporary social relevance. Fantasy traits given to the characters such as levitation, telepathy, and telekinesis help to encompass modern political realities that can be phantasmagorical. Real world setting. The existence of fantastic elements in the real world provides the basis for magical realism. Writers do not invent new worlds, but rather they reveal the magical in the existing world, as was done by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who wrote the seminal work 100 Years of mm, Solitude. In the in the world of magical realism, the supernatural realm blends with the natural familiar world. Authorial reticence. Authorial reticence is the deliberate withholding of information and explanations about the disconcerting fictitious world. The narrator is indifferent, a characteristic enhanced by this absence of explanation of fantastic events. The story proceeds with logical precision, as if nothing extraordinary had taken place. Magical events are presented as ordinary occurrences. Therefore, the reader accepts the marvelous as normal and common. Explaining the supernatural world or presenting it as extraordinary would immediately reduce its legitimacy relative to the natural world. The reader would consequently disregard the supernatural as false testimony. Plentitude. In his essay, The Baroque and the Marvelous Real, Cuban writer Alejo Carpentier defines the Baroque by a lack of emptiness, a departure from structure or rules, and an extraordinary abundance, plenitude of disorienting detail. He cites Mondrian as its opposite. From the angle Carpentier views the Baroque as a layering of elements which translates easily into the post-colonial or transcultural Latin American atmosphere that he emphasizes in the kingdom of this world. America, a continent of symbiosis, mutations, mestizazi, and engenders the Baroque made explicit by elaborate Aztec temples and associative Nahua, Nahua, um, uh, Nahuatl poetry. These mixing ethnicities grow together with the American Baroque. The space in between is where the marvelous real is seen. Marvelous, not meaning beautiful and pleasant, but extraordinary, strange, and excellent. Such a complex system of layering encompassed in the Latin American boom novel, such as 100 Years of Solitude, aims towards translating the scope of America. Hybridity. Magical realism plot lines characteristically employ hybrid multiple planes of reality that take place in inharmonious arenas of such opposites as urban and rural and western and indigenous. Metafiction. The trait centers on the reader's role in literature with its multiple realities and a specific reference to the reader's world. It explores the impact fiction has an on reality on fiction and the reader's role in between. As such, it is well suited for drawing attention to social or political criticism. Furthermore, it is the tool paramount in the execution of a related and major magic realist phenomenon, textualization. The term defines two conditions. First, where a fictitious reader enters the story within a story enters the story within a story while reading it, making them self-conscious of their status as readers. And secondly, where the textual world enters into the reader's real world. Good sense would negate the process, but magic is the flexible convention that allows it. Heightened awareness of mystery, something that most critics agree on this major theme. Magic realist literature tends to read at an intensified level, taking 100 years of solitude. The, the reader must let go of pre-existing ties to conventional exposition, plot advancement, linear time structure, scientific reason, etc., to strive for a state of heightened awareness of life's connectedness or hidden meanings. Louis Liel articulates this feeling as to seize the mystery that breathes behind things, and supports the claim by saying a writer must heighten his senses to the point of estado, a limit state or extreme, in order to realize all levels of reality, most importantly that of mystery. Political critic. Magic realism contains an implicit criticism of society, particularly the elite, especially with regard to Latin America. The style breaks from the arguable discourse of privileged centers of literature. This is a book primarily about and for eccentrics, the geographically, socially, and economically marginalized. Therefore, magic realism's alternative world works to correct the reality of established viewpoints like realism, naturalism, modernism. Magic realists Magic realist texts under this logic are subversive texts, revolutionary against socially dominant forces, or alternatively, the socially dominant may implement magical realism to dissociate themselves from their power discourse. Theo Dehan calls this change in perspective decentering. In his review of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel Chronicle of a Death Foretold, Salman Rushdie argues that the formal experiment of magic realism allows political ideas to be expressed in ways that might not be possible through more established literary forms. El realismo magico, magic realism, at least as practiced by Marquez, is a development out of surrealism that expresses a genuinely a third world consciousness. It deals with that Naipaul has called half-made societies in which the impossibly old struggles against the appallingly new, in which public corruptions and private anguishes are somewhat more garish and extreme than they ever get in the so-called North, where centuries of wealth and power have formed their thick layers over the surface of what's really going on. In the works of Marquez, as in the world, he describes impossible things happen constantly and quite plausibly out in the open under the middle sun. Origins. Literary magic realism originated in Latin America. Writers often traveled between their home country and European cultural hubs, such as Paris or Berlin, and were influenced by the art movement of the time. Cuban writer Alejo Carpentier and Venezuelan Arturo Asler and Petri, for example, were strongly influenced by European artist movements such as Surrealism during their stays in Paris in the 1920s and 1930s. One major event that linked painterly and literary magic realisms was the translation and publication of Franz Rose's book into Spanish by Spain's Revista de Occidente in 1927, headed by major event that linked painterly and literary magic realisms was the translation and publication of Franz Rose's book into Spanish by Spain's Revista de Occidente in 1927. Within a year, magic realism was being applied to the prose of European authors in the literary circles of Buenos Aires. George Louis Borges inspired and encouraged other Latin American writers in the development of magical realism, particularly with his first magical realist publication, Historia Universal de la Infamia, in 1935. Between 1940 and 1950, magical realism in Latin America reached its peak, with prominent writers appearing mainly in Argentina. Alejo Carpenter's novel The Kingdom of This World, published in 1949, is often characterized as an important harbinger of magic realism, which reached its most canonical incarnation in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel 100 Years of Solitude, published in 1967. The theoretical implications of visual arts magic realism greatly influenced European and Latin American literature. Italian Massimo Bontempelli, for instance, claimed that literature could be a means to create a collective consciousness by opening new mythical and magical perspectives on reality, and used his writings to inspire an Italian nation governed by fascism. Poetry was closely associated with Rose's form of magic realism, and knew Bontempelli in Paris, rather than follow Carpentier's developing versions of the Latin American marvelous real. Usler Petri's writings emphasize the mystery of human living amongst the reality of life. He believed magic realism was a continuation of the vanguardia or avant-garde modernist experimental writings of Latin America. Major topics in criticism: ambiguities in definition. Mexican critic Louis Lille summed up the difficulty of divining magical realism by writing, if you can explain it, then it's not magical realism. He offers his own definition by writing without thinking of the concept of magical realism. Each writer gives the expression to a reality he observes in the people. To me, magical realism is an attitude on the part of the characters in the novel toward the world or toward nature. Lil and Gunther both quote Arturo Uslar Paitri, who described man as a mystery surrounded by realistic life. A poetic prediction or a poetic denial of reality. What for? What for lack of another name could be called a magical realism? It is worth noting that Paitri, in presenting his term for his literary tendency, always kept its definition open by means of a language more lyrical and evocative than strictly critical, as in this 1948 statement, when academic critics attempted to define magical realism with scholarly exactitude. They discovered that it was more powerful than precise. Critics, frustrated by their inability to pin down the term's meaning, have urged its complete abandonment. Yet, in the poetry's vague, ample usage, magical realism was wildly successful in summarizing for many readers their perception of much Latin American fiction. This fact suggests that the term has its uses so long as it is not expected to function with the precision expected of a technical scholarly terminology. Western and native worldviews. The critical perspective towards magical realism as a conflict between reality and abnormality stems from the Western reader's dissociation with mythology, a root of magical realism more easily understood by non Western cultures. Western confusion regarding magical realism is due to the conception of the real created in a magical realist text rather than explain reality using natural or physical laws as in typical Western texts. Magical realist texts create a reality in which the relation between incidents, characters, and setting could not be based upon or justified by their status within the physical world or their normal acceptance by bourgeois mentality. Guatemalan author William Spindler's article Magic Realism Typology suggests that there are three kinds of magic realism, which, however, are by no means incompatible. European metaphysical magic realism, European metaphysical magic realism, with its sense of estrangement and the uncanny, exemplified by Kafka's fiction, by Kafka's fiction, Kafka's fiction, ontological, ontological magical realism characterized by matter of factness in relating inexplicable events, and anthropological magical realism where a native worldview is set side by side with the Western rational worldwide. Spindler's typology of magic realism has been criticized as an act of categorization with seeks to define magic realism as a culturally specific project by identifying for his readers those non-modern societies where myth and magic persist and where magic realism might be expected to occur. Western modes of thinking, and it is possible to conceive of instances where both orders of knowledge are simultaneously possible. The marvelous may be easily confused with magical realism, as both modes uh, introduce uh, introduce supernatural events without surprising the implied author. In both, these magical events are expected and accepted as everyday occurrences. However, the marvelous world is unidimensional. The marvelous world is unidimensional world. The implied author believes that anything can happen here, as the entire world is filled with supernatural beings and situations to begin with. Fairy tales are a good example of marvelous literature. The important idea in defining the marvelous is that readers understand that this fictional world is different from the world where they live. The marvelous one dimensional world differs from the bi-dimensional world of magical realism. As in the latter, the supernatural realm blends with the natural, familiar world, arriving at the combination of two layers of reality, bi-dimensional, while some use the terms magical realism and and low real marveloso interchangeably. The key difference lies in the focus. Critic Louis Lill attests that Carpentier was an originating pillar of the magical realist style, by implicitly referring to the latter's critical works, writing that the existence of the marvelous real is what started magical realist literature, which some critics claim is the truly American literature. It can consequently be drawn that Carpenter's low real marveloso is spatially distinct from magical realism by the fact that the former applies specifically to America on that note. Lee A. Daniel categorizes critics of Carpentier into three groups: those that do those that do not consider him a magical realist whatsoever, Angel Flores. Those all call him a magico realista, a writer with no mention of his low real marveloso. Gomez Gil, Gianfranco Carlos Fuentes, and those that use the term uh, interchangeably: Fernando Algeria, Louis Lille, Emir Rodriguez Montecristo. The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake by Amy Bender. The particular sadness of lemon cake sounds like a metaphor, but in this book it's both allegorical and literal, as the protagonist, a young girl, eats eats feelings that aren't her own. With every bite of food she takes, she absorbs the feelings of whoever made it, not just observes them, but literally ingests the pain, the boredom, the glee, the fear. Talk about a bad taste in your mouth. As expected, it leads to some trouble. When she bites into a lemon birthday cake, lovingly baked by her mother, she discovers that behind the facade of a tear there is deep despair. Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. Rooted in historical events, Midnight's Children takes place during the partition of British India in 1948. It also weaves in folklore from Arabian Nights, and the narrator has telepathic powers. If you are curious to learn more about the history but also prefer to study it through the lens of literature, pick up this book. What is not yours by Helen Quamey. Each short story in Helen Quamey's debut collection revolves around a key and the lock it opens. There is a mysterious and magical diary, a blooming garden, a library with living books, and a house where the rooms won't close unless you have the lock to shut them. It is the perfect dose of magical realism, and we love that there is common thread to each impressionistic short story. Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami, Japanese, Japanese author. Half of the chapters in this book unfold the story of a young runaway named Kafka who leaves home to escape a curse, while the other half revolves around an older man who has left home for the first time to find a lost cat. Their lives become entangled through obscurely so. These are allusions to Oedipus, a murder investigation, plenty of references to pop culture and talking animals. Haruki Murakami is an expert storyteller, and this is a great one to start with if you haven't read any of his work yet. The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. Relentless, brilliantly beautiful, and heartbreaking, this story has a little bit of everything. There is family tragedy, forbidden love, political unrest, and alliteration galore. So you will enjoy it, whether you are looking for something literary, if or you are in the mood for a plot-driven novel. As the title implies, the reader witnesses the interconnection between mundane details and lofty, large-scale happenings, both good and bad. Mm, Though not overtly a magical realism book, it will it still plays with the genre. For example, uh, everything has a personality, whether it is the house, a feeling, the country, the characters themselves, a coffin, or a dead child in the coffin. The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston. Who knew a memoir could be included in a list of magical realism books? That's just one more reason to consider Maxine Hong Kingston, an ingenious pioneer, now considered an American classic. This memoir challenges the conventions of the genre and offers new ways to tell stories that represent the ways in which truth, memory, and make believe often overlap. Neither straight autobiography nor fiction, she writes about the family's past, Chinese legend, and her own childhood. 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Perhaps the most critically acclaimed magical realism book of all time. 100 Years of Solitude deserves a place in any avid reader's library. You will be transported to the fictional Colombian town of Macondo, where Garcia Marquez creates an enchanting universe full of colorful jungles, a city made of mirrors, and people who live for hundreds of years. Beyond the spellbinding plot itself, this book is full of quotable moments and passages. It's a bit like a surreal painting in that supernatural chaos living right next to mundane, every everyday, everyday reality. Beloved, Beloved by Toni Morrison. This unforgettable story is so much more than just a ghost story. It reveals the ways in which slavery's legacy maintains a strong, haunting presence throughout the Reconstruction and into the present. It also emphasizes the transformative but undefinable power of romantic, maternal, and self love. In many ways, it reads like a love story. Autumn by Ali Smith. Though Ali Smith is often discussed as a postmodern novelist, she is also known to dabble in magical realism. If you love books that offer experimental representations of time, both formally and thematically, this is the book for you. Her writing is evocative and unique because she does not strive to capture the human experience through linear time, but rather through the internal consciousness of her characters. Interestingly, her latest project is a series of four books, each separated neatly by seasons, which is a which is a traditional measurement of the passing of time. But don't be fooled. She still manages to push boundaries and create only innovative stories. Autumn is the first in the quartet. The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. Spanning decades and three generations of the Trueba family, the House of the Spirits plays with notions of fate and destiny, lineage and family bonds, and the ways in which tragedies can become miracles. Allende's masterpiece is a prime example of magical realism. So pick this up if you are looking for an enthralling introduction to the genre. The Immortalists by uh, Chloe Chloe Benjamin. This book has it all: an alluring setting, New York City's Lower East Side in 1969, a relatable yet a complicated, a driving question. Would you want to know the day of your death if someone could predict it? And entertaining family, entertaining family dynamics that span multiple decades and cities. In the Immortalists, uh, Chloe Benjamin introduces introduces us a mystic uh, a mystic who predicts that death for four teenage siblings. They then set out to live their lives as self fulfilling prophecies, revealing the ways in which fate does and does not exist. Each sibling experiments with the different notions of magic, reality, fantasy, science, and immortality. Finally, I would like to discuss Virginia Woolf, Orlando. Orlando is a bit of everything, not quite surrealism, not quite fantasy of science fiction. This book involves unconventional narrative devices that stretch our imaginations without using magic in the plot. The metafictional novel presents itself as a biography, as the narrator tracks the experiences of an individual over the course of their 300 year life. As it progresses, it becomes a highly imaginative story uh, wherein the protagonist is both timeless and gender fluid. Woolf uses this book as a space to urge her readers to move away from traditional notions of truth as objective. Legend, fiction, and biography alike, as with all of Woolf's work, it is a brilliant masterpiece, full of wisdom beyond its time. And last, if on a winter's night, a traveler by Calvino. For anyone who loves innovative forms and anything meta, pick up this groundbreaking novel by Italo Calvino. Uh, if on a winter's night a traveler is about you, the reader, reading. If on a winter's night a traveler, each chapter is broken up into two sections. The first being a second person narration that uses prolepsis, basically describing you as you and what you are about to read in the next chapter. And the second is the fictional plot. It will make you reflect on the nature of reality, art, and perception, while also being thoroughly entertaining and mind blowing. Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This collection of short stories is a captivating read. It's eerie, erotic, absurd, and effective. One story is a series of passages with each one reimagining an episode of Law and Order, a special victims unit. I would like to conclude this lecture with Visions by George Louis Borges. We want to dabble in magical realism but aren't ready to commit to a full-on novel. Try this novel. Uh, a full-on novel. Try this collection of short stories to get a taste of magical realism in its purest form. Each story in George Louis Borges's collection wrestles with grand ideas and philosophical context through playful and accessible narratives, which makes them very fun to read. This way, dear students, uh, I have concluded. I have finished my lecture. The lecture is over. Thank you. Thanks for your patient hearing to me and your presence also. Thanks, and thanks to all of you. Thanks to all of you.